Amateurs sit and wait for inspiration. The rest of us get up and go to work.
If you could spend any day with any of your characters from your books, who would it be and why?
A lot of the best work comes from writing when you're not necessarily in the mood for it.
Wonder was what inspired you to complete Time Traveling with a Hamster, but what made you start it in the first place?
I think of something impossible happening, and then I think, but what if it really happened? Cure for writer's block is to get up, have a drink of water, go for a walk, and then check his bank balance.
If you ever wrote a book inspired by India, what would the title be? Hello everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Shiv Nadar School Podcast. Imagine this. A 12-year-old boy wakes up on his birthday and finds his future self staring at him. Or a teenager builds a time machine with an old typewriter. Sounds like science fiction, right? But these aren't just some crazy ideas. These are humorous, imaginative, and heartwarming stories that have been written by someone who knows just how to mix magic with real life. This author is the brilliant and creative mind behind many books like Time Traveling with a Hamster, The 1,000-Year-Old Boy. Welcome to India and the Shiv Nadar School Podcast, Mr. Welford.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. What a lovely introduction.
Thank you. First things first, how has your experience in India been so far?
People keep feeding me. It's amazing. I love it. Everywhere I go, people are offering me food. It's lovely. Do you do that all the time? It's an Indian thing, I think. Yeah, but I love it. It's been so nice.
Have you seen anything yet that you think might inspire a new story or a character?
Do you know what? Just today, I was thinking of the cows, the bulls that you have in the street here. And that was very strange. We don't do that in the UK. And I was thinking, maybe there's a story there in these mysterious animals. And I was asking, where do they come from? Where do they go? Where do they live? They just live in the streets. I think that's fascinating.
So speaking of characters, if you could spend any day with any of your characters from your books, who would it be and why?
Oh, of any of them. I think Al Chowdhury from Time Traveling with a Hamster, and now Time Traveling with a Tortoise, because he's come back. Simply because he's got a time machine, you know? And who wouldn't want a time machine? I love Al. He was probably the first character I invented, him and his grandpa. But I think anybody who's got a time machine gets my vote, you know, because who wouldn't want to try out a time machine? So,
a time machine. You write science fiction, and I think it's a lot of authors, like me. I've just been experimenting a bit, and I find myself drawn towards writing realistic fiction because I experience things and I can write about it. But science fiction is not something that you see around you or talk about or hear about all the time. So where do you really get your ideas from? And your titles, they're so creative.
Titles, usually they're not made up by me. I'm hopeless at titles. That's my editor, who's much, much better at titles than I am. But coming up with the science fiction concepts, I never expected to be a science fiction writer, really. It only happened because I wrote one story, which was Time Traveling with a Hamster. And after that, my editors wanted another one. And I wrote something that was a bit science fiction-y, which was about a girl who became invisible, in What Not to Do If You Turn Invisible. And I realized then that I was writing about this magic real-life science crossover. And I thought, I'll stick with that. So that's how that came about. It was more by accident than by anything else. I never had a big passion to write science fiction stories. But once I'd done a couple, I realized I liked doing it. So I stuck with it.
Your characters are so relatable and unique. And the worlds they live in are so imaginative. Where do you start with all this?
It normally comes to a character and a situation together. I'll think of something impossible. I'll think of something impossible happening. It might be living forever, it might be having a time machine, it might be being invisible or something. Anything that we know is impossible. And then I think, but what if it really happened? You know? And I think, and then I'll put a kid, because I'm writing for kids, I'll put a kid of about 10 or 11, 12 years old into that situation and think, what would really happen if that really happened to a child? A good example is What Not to Do If You Turn Invisible. There'd been a lot of, and there still are, quite a lot of stories of children who discover invisibility, you know. And usually those stories, it's good fun. You know, I'm invisible, I can go and prank people, or I can do that. And I began to think, no, that wouldn't happen in real life. If you woke up and you discovered you were invisible, you'd be terrified. You'd genuinely be terrified. It wouldn't be fun at all. And so that's what happens to Ethel in What Not to Do If You Turn Invisible. She's scared, and she has to deal with it. And that usually is a pattern for most of my stories, is that the kids discover something that might seem fun, but it turns out being less fun than they thought, and then they have to work their way out of it.
Amazing. I will definitely use this.
Good luck.
I think that's what brings in the realism in your book, along with the fiction. That was when I read Time Traveling with a Hamster, that was something that really stood out to me. And I think most of us readers really like that about your books. It's what makes them so special and different.
Thanks. Yeah, I think one of the other things that maybe helps with that is that they're in a real 21st century situation. They're not in a fictional town somewhere in a fictional book. They are actually living in the towns that I write about are real, you know, and these kids go to real schools with real friends, you know, so it's magic happening in a non-magical world, if you like.
So sir, who has inspired you to write such great books for children?
I have lots of inspirations, really. I never think of them as inspiring me directly, because that would feel a bit like copying them, which I don't want to do. But the authors that I've really admired, well, certainly when I was growing up, Enid Blyton. You know, I loved Enid Blyton. More recently, J.K. Rowling, I think, is an absolute genius. You know, the Harry Potter world is so well worked out, and she writes with such care and precision about a world that I could never even imagine. And most recently and most directly, I would say, there's a writer called American writer called R.J. Palacio, who wrote Wonder. I don't know if you've come across Wonder.
Yeah.
And without Wonder, I might not have written Time Traveling with a Hamster, because I'd sort of started writing it. I was writing it in the third person about a boy called Andy. He wasn't called Al at that stage. He was called Andy. And I'd written a few chapters and I didn't really like it. And at the same time, I was reading Wonder by R.J. Palacio. And all my family, my kids at that time were about 10, 11 years old. And we were all as a family, we were reading R.J. Palacio's Wonder. And I realised that she, as a middle-aged woman, had written this book in the first person about Augie Pullman, who's about 10 or 11. And that had never occurred to me. I'd never thought that writing in the first person was something that I should or could do as a middle-aged man. And as soon as I changed Hamster into first person, I started it again. I thought, inspired by R.J. Palacio, I thought, I'll give first person a go. And I started writing as Al. And it all came together, and I realised this is how I need to write the story. So, without RJ Palacio, I probably wouldn't be here.
Sir, what advice would you give to young writers like us to pursue their career of writing?
The best advice I can give to any writer, young or old, is to finish something. It sounds simple, but it's the thing that gets in the way of almost all amateur writers, is that they start writing something and they discover it's difficult, because it is. You get to a difficult plot point, and you think, how am I going to get them out of this? And then you stop. And you stop and you put it away and you start something else. Or you start the same story again. But forgetting about starting again. Get through what you're writing somehow or other. Leave a plot hole if you have to. Just leave that difficult bit and move on to the next bit. And somehow limp to the end where you can type the end. And then you can go back to the beginning. And once you get to the end, you know what it's about. So you go back to the beginning, you start again, and you will then have discovered ways of filling in those gaps, getting over that plot point, and because you'll know what your ending is going to be, and you'll know what your target is, so it becomes much, much easier. So that's my top tip. Somehow get to the end of something.
I definitely agree.
Yeah.
I'm stuck in like this piece I was writing right now, and I think I'm definitely going to use that advice now.
We all know that creativity can be tough sometimes. How do you come up with such fascinating ideas?
Good question. I think the key to coming up with ideas is to work every day, and to go to your desk when you're not in the mood. Stephen King, who is not a writer for children, but he's written about 70 bestsellers, and he says, amateurs sit and wait for inspiration. The rest of us get up and go to work. And I have that printed out on my wall at home. And the rest of us is professional writers. And you go to work and you write something. Just something, and from that something, you hope an idea might come.
What an amazing perspective.
Like you mentioned, wonder was what inspired you to to complete Time Traveling with a Hamster. But what made you start it in the first place and make that transition from media to literature?
The thing that prompted me to start writing was I needed a job. I was unemployed. And I'd been working in television, and then I moved abroad. So I was living in Sweden, where I didn't speak Swedish at the time, and so I couldn't work, and I had lots of spare time, and I didn't want to go back home after these years in Sweden and say to people I'd done nothing, just hung around doing nothing. So I had lots of spare time, and so I thought I would use it to try to write a story, and so that's how that came about. I needed a job, and I also kind of knew that my career in TV was winding down. I was getting a bit bored with it, and I think people were getting bored with me. So I realised that I needed something else to do. So I thought I'll give writing a chance, and I was very lucky that it worked out.
And I mean, if you hadn't started writing, we wouldn't have gotten so many wonderful novels to read.
Wow, thank you.
Also, sir, towards the end of any story you have written, has a character ever surprised you with their, personality and?
Yeah, all the time, and it's not only towards the end. It's all the way through. I think I think that's the secret that comes with rewriting a book, which is where all of the best stuff happens. Is that as I was saying, you somehow get to the end of your story, And that's when you go back to the beginning and you start rewriting. That's when you discover that you've made a character do something that's not necessarily consistent with his or her character. And so it might just be some dialogue, you know, and you realize that person wouldn't say that, you know, because you've got to the end and you know how the people that you've invented, how they behave. So you say, that person wouldn't say that. Maybe I'll give that bit of dialogue to somebody else, you know. And then when you have a character that's very well developed, like for example Grandpa Byron, I know now what he sounds like. So when I'm writing him, his stuff just comes to me. And I think, oh right, I know how he speaks. So that's a fully rounded character. But that only comes after having got to the end and having worked on it, you know. So characters do surprise you, but then you do have to go back and make sure that they are consistent, so that they sound like themselves.
So is there any structured process you use throughout your novel that us young writers could use?
I would say it's difficult. It's difficult when you're young. And it's also difficult. I think in some ways it's easier for me because I write full time. It's my job, you know. So I know I have to do it every day, and that can become a bit of a chore if you're young. If you feel you have to write every day, but I would say that a lot of the best work comes from. It comes from writing when you're not necessarily in the mood for it. You know, and you know that you have to write something. But as for structure of how I tend to start at the beginning. I tend to write without a plan, which is not how all authors write. For example, J.K. Rowling, for example, wrote famously. You can see it you can go online and see her handwritten plan for the whole 7 Harry Potter books, and it's all written out like a flowchart and one of those, you know, and he does this, and then that leads to this, and that. I couldn't do that. And she spent years doing this before she started writing. That's not me. That's just not me. I couldn't do that. And the idea that you have to have a plan before you start writing is what put me off writing for many, many years. So. No, I write without a plan, and it works for me. And if that works for you, do that. You know, there's more than one way to get a book written.
Sir, what's the most important element that you keep in mind while writing for children?
Nobody swears. Yeah, it's no. Seriously, I try to channel my inner 11-year-old. You know, and always think, would I want to continue reading? You know, and that involves like chapter endings and all sorts of things to keep the action moving. You've got to remember that children particularly, but adults as well, but children particularly, have got so many other things that they want to do. You know, you might want to go out and play football. You might want to go and play on your Xbox. You might go and watch YouTube or listen to some music. You know, all of these other forms of entertainment are available, and so it's quite important to keep the action going to keep young readers entertained.
Do you ever get stuck with an idea or get writer's block?
Writer's block? Oh, yes. Yeah, I do. It's no big deal. My friend Piers Torday says his cure for writer's block is to get up, have a drink of water, go for a walk, and then check his bank balance. You know, which he says is very important to getting him back to the desk to work. I tend not to think of it. I tend to think of it as just getting stuck. You know, which is a normal part of the process. You just get a bit stuck. I've never been in a situation where I couldn't finish anything, but that's probably because I've got a contract, and if I don't finish it, I don't get paid. I think writer's block probably affects amateur writers more than it does professional writers, because professionals, if that's your job, that's your job. Like any job, you have to do it. You have to get up and go to work.
What do you do when you're not writing? We've heard a rumor that you play the guitar. Is that true?
Guitar? I wish. No, I play the piano. I read. That's no surprise. I walk my dog. I have tropical fish I look after. And I like watching and practicing magic. So, I do all of that. So I've got a full life of hobbies. And I think everybody needs hobbies.
Mr. Ross, we'd like to end this with the final question. If you ever wrote a book inspired by India, what would the title be?
Well, what a good question. Of course, I already used India as an inspiration for two of my books. Time Travelling with a Hamster and Time Travelling with a Tortoise. So if I did do it again, I would probably go back to those characters, and I would love to write about Grandpa Byron, and maybe Grandpa Byron, the early years. I could go back. And
like a prequel.
I could do a prequel about how Grandpa Byron ended up coming to England, because he's a mystical character in many ways, and he's very wise, and I love writing about him. So that's probably what I would do.
Thank you so much for coming here. That was definitely a very insightful session with Mr. Ross. Stay tuned for the upcoming episodes. That's a wrap for this one. Till then, keep learning and stay curious.